Picture this: a forest made not of trees, but of bodies. 20,000 of them impaled on giant spikes, rotting in the sun. This was the welcome sign for an invading army, a masterpiece of fear created by just one man. He was a 15th century prince, a hero to his people, a monster to everyone else. But did the real-life horror show of Vlad the Impaler, the guy who literally dined among corpses, actually inspire the most famous vampire of all time, Count Dracula? When you hear the name Dracula, you probably picture a fancy, caped vampire who's allergic to sunlight. That character, created by author Bram Stoker in 1897, is the blueprint for every vampire we know. But behind this fiction is a real man whose actual life was way more terrifying than any myth. His name was Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, but you probably know him by his other name, Vlad the Impaler. His story is an insane mix of war, backstabbing, and cruelty that's hard to even imagine. This is the story of a guy who used pure terror as a weapon, who slaughtered tens of thousands and became a legend for his sadism. We're talking about stories of nailing hats to guys' heads and literally feasting while surrounded by dying people. So where does the man stop and the monster begin? How did a Christian prince, fighting to defend his home, get tangled up with the legend of a blood-sucking vampire? To figure it out, we have to go back to a dark and violent time and unpack the life of the man they called Dracula. To get how someone becomes the Impaler, you have to see the world that made him. Vlad III was born around 1431 in Transylvania. His dad, Vlad II, was the ruler of Wallachia, a region in modern-day Romania. This place was stuck between two giants, the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary. Just surviving meant you had to be ruthless. Vlad's destiny and his famous name got sealed when his father joined a group called the Order of the Dragon. It was a society of knights sworn to defend Christianity from its enemies, mainly the Ottoman Turks. When he joined, Vlad II took the name Dracul, which is Romanian for dragon. So his son, Vlad III, became Dracula, which just means son of the dragon. Back then, it was a name of honor. But language is funny, and in some dialects, Dracul could also mean the devil, a little bit of foreshadowing there. But Vlad's dad played both sides, and it blew up in his face. In 1442, to prove he was loyal to the Ottoman Sultan, he had to give up his two young sons, Vlad and his brother Radu, as political hostages. Vlad was just a kid, around 11, when he was ripped from his home and thrown into the heart of the enemy's empire. He and his brother were basically fancy prisoners. They got a great education, but they were also at the mercy of the Sultan. This is where Vlad's deep-seated hatred for the Ottomans grew, along with his resentment for his own brother, Radu, who got along a little too well with his captors. Then, in 1447, everything fell apart. While still a hostage, Vlad's father and his older brother, Mircea, were betrayed and murdered by their own nobles. His dad was killed in a swamp, and his brother was reportedly tortured, blinded, and buried alive. At 16, Vlad was an orphan, his family destroyed by their own people. This was the final lesson in a childhood of violence and betrayal. It taught him that power is everything, mercy is for the weak, and trust is something he could never afford. The boy they sent away as a pawn was coming back to Wallachia to take his throne and get revenge on everyone. The Impaler was born. After a failed attempt to take the throne in 1448, Vlad spent the next 8 years in exile, getting ready for his comeback. That moment hit in 1456. With Hungary's help, he stormed Wallachia, killed his rival, and finally took his father's throne. Now in charge, Vlad Dracula began his life's work, securing his power and getting rid of his enemies. And he did it with a level of cruelty that would make him infamous. His first targets were the boyars, the nobles who had betrayed his family. The most legendary story about his revenge goes like this. Vlad threw a huge Easter feast and invited hundreds of the most powerful boyar families, including those who had a hand in his father and brother's murders. After dinner, he locked the doors. The older nobles were dragged outside and immediately impaled on stakes. The younger ones were marched off to become slave labor, rebuilding a remote castle. In one move, he shattered the power of the nobility and sent a message to anyone else who thought about crossing him. But he didn't stop with the elites. Vlad was obsessed with order. He went after anyone he thought was dishonest, immoral, or just lazy. German pamphlets from the time, likely exaggerated propaganda, were filled with insane stories of his cruelty, like roasting children and making their mothers eat them. Whether true or not, they show a ruler who used absolute terror to control everything. His go-to method of execution, the one that gave him his nickname, was impalement. It was designed to be a slow and agonizing death. A long, sharp pole was carefully run through the victim's body, avoiding vital organs to make the suffering last as long as possible. The stake was then stood upright, and the person's own weight would slowly pull them down, a process that could take hours or even days. This was his signature punishment, designed for maximum psychological horror. There's a crazy legend that he placed a golden cup in the main square of his capital, Targovishte. Anyone could drink from it, but it could never be stolen. In a kingdom he had terrified into submission, the story goes that the cup was never touched. It's probably not true, but the legend perfectly captures his reputation. A land of perfect order built on pure fear. His cruelty wasn't just for his own people. When Ottoman diplomats refused to take off their turbans in his presence, citing religious custom, Vlad said he'd be happy to strengthen their custom. He then ordered his guards to nail the turbans to their skulls. The message to the Sultan was loud and clear. Wallachia will not bow down. By 1462, Sultan Mehmed II, the famous conqueror of Constantinople, had enough of Vlad's defiance. He gathered a massive army. Some sources claim it was over 100,000 strong, though it was likely closer to 60,000, and marched to crush Wallachia. Vlad was ridiculously outnumbered, with maybe 30,000 men at best. He knew a straight-up fight was suicide, so he turned to what he did best: guerrilla warfare and psychological terror. As the huge Ottoman army pushed forward, they found a wasteland. Vlad had burned his own villages and poisoned the wells. He launched non-stop surprise attacks, hitting the Ottoman lines before disappearing back into the forests. He was trying to bleed them, starve them, and break their spirit. This all led up to one of the most insane moves of his entire life: the night attack of Targovishte. On June 17, 1462, Vlad, disguised as a Turk, snuck into the main Ottoman camp with a small team. Their mission? Assassinate the Sultan. They caused absolute chaos, slaughtering soldiers in their tents. They never reached the Sultan's tent, but the attack sent panic through the Ottoman army. But Vlad's masterpiece of horror was still to come. As Mehmed pushed forward to the capital, Targovishte, he saw something so horrifying it would go down in history. For miles outside the city, Vlad had created a forest of 20,000 captured and impaled Turks. It was a silent, rotting landscape of death. A Greek historian wrote that the Sultan himself, a man known for his own brutality, was so disgusted by the sight that he just turned his army around and left. The psychological blow was more powerful than any army. And this is where we get the most disturbing legend of all: the prince who dined among corpses. German illustrations from the time show Vlad casually eating at a table set up in the middle of his forest of the impaled, as his victims writhed around him. The most shocking version of the story claims he would dip his bread in the blood of his victims, a detail that sounds an awful lot like a certain vampire myth. Did this actually happen? It's impossible to know for sure. It was written down by his enemies, so it was probably exaggerated. But whether it was fact or just killer propaganda, it cemented his image as a monster who loved human suffering, a man who became a legend of pure terror. For hundreds of years, Vlad the Impaler was just a figure in Romanian history, a brutal but heroic defender of his homeland. The vampire connection didn't exist. So how did he become the world's most famous vampire? The answer is in the library of a 19th century Irish writer named Bram Stoker. When Stoker started writing his horror novel, his villain's name was Count Dracula. It wasn't until he was doing some research that he found the name that would change everything. Stoker checked out a book called An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. The book briefly mentioned a 15th century prince named Dracula who fought the Turks. What really caught Stoker's eye was a tiny footnote that said in the Wallachian language, Dracula could mean devil. For an author writing about pure evil, this was gold. The name was powerful and sounded demonic. He wrote it down in his notes, and Count Dracula became Count Dracula. The idea that Stoker based the entire character on Vlad the Impaler is mostly a modern myth, made popular in the 1970s. Stoker's own notes show he barely researched the real Vlad. The Count in the book is a Hungarian noble from Transylvania, not a Wallachian prince. There's no mention of impalement or dining among corpses. Stoker just borrowed a cool, scary-sounding name and a couple of historical details to make his story feel more real. So where did the blood drinking come from? Not from the real Vlad. The vampire traits in Stoker's novel, the fangs, immortality, and fear of garlic, all came from European folklore and other vampire stories, not the life of a Romanian prince. And yet, the connection stuck, and maybe for a good reason. Even though Stoker didn't know all the gory details, he accidentally picked a guy who embodied the spirit of his monster. Both were cruel, powerful rulers from a distant land who inspired absolute terror. The real Dracula spilled the blood of thousands to keep his power. The fictional Dracula drank blood to keep his unnatural life. Popular culture just blended the two, mixing the real-world horror of the man with the supernatural horror of the myth. Vlad the Impaler wasn't a vampire, but his brutal life made him the perfect host for the king of all vampires. Vlad's brutal reign couldn't last. Even though his terror tactics had scared off Mehmed II, the Ottomans just put a new guy in charge, Vlad's own brother, Radu, who was loyal to the Sultan. Vlad had to flee to Hungary in 1462 to ask for help from his ally, King Matthias Corvinus. But instead of help, Vlad got a prison cell. The Hungarians didn't want a war with the Ottomans, so they locked him up. Vlad was a prisoner for years. He eventually got out and took back his throne one last time in 1476. But his victory was short-lived. Just a few months later, while marching into another battle against the Turks, Vlad and his small army were ambushed and killed. He was about 45 years old. The details of his death are a mystery. The Ottomans supposedly cut off his head, preserved it in honey, and sent it to Constantinople. There, it was put on a stake for everyone to see, a final, grim message that the Impaler was dead. But what about his body? This is where history turns into legend. The most popular story is that monks buried him at a monastery on an island in Lake Snagov, near Bucharest. But when archaeologists checked the tomb marked as his, it was empty. Another theory is that he was buried at the Kamana monastery, which he founded. A newer, more controversial idea claims his daughter secretly took his remains to a church in Naples, Italy. To this day, the final resting place of Vlad the Impaler is one of history's great unsolved mysteries. A fitting end for a man who lived and died in legend. So, did the real-life atrocities of Vlad the Impaler inspire Count Dracula? The answer is basically yes and no. Bram Stoker probably just liked his scary name and his reputation as a fierce warrior. The vampire in his book was mostly made up, yet history found a way to connect them. The real Prince Dracula, a man who ruled with terror, impaled thousands, and might have eaten dinner in a forest of corpses, turned out to be the perfect anchor for our greatest fictional monster. He wasn't a vampire, but the horrors he committed in the real world were so extreme, they blur the line between man and myth. Vlad's legacy is a wild reminder that sometimes real history is way scarier than fiction. He's still seen as a national hero in Romania for defending their homeland, and as a symbol of pure cruelty everywhere else. His story makes you ask some dark questions about power, violence, and the thin line between a patriot and a monster. The prince who dined among corpses is long gone, but his legend, now tied forever to the vampire, refuses to stay buried. If you were fascinated by this journey into the dark heart of history, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories that uncover the truth behind the legends. And let us know in the comments. Do you see Vlad the Impaler as a hero, a villain, or something else entirely? Thanks for watching.